All right, Master Gardener Trainee. This is Vegetable Gardening Part 3. Uh, be watering. If I go the right way, you'll see that. And obviously a different person. But there's a watering can I do like to keep close by when I'm putting them in so that they get a drink of water with that dilute starter fertilizer solution. Other plant parts that you might start growing in the ground, you can take cuttings from sweet potatoes or slips if you've ever heard that term. Heck, you can plant the whole sweet potato and it will sprout. You don't need the biggest ones. You don't even need ones that are perfectly firm and blemish free. You can maybe even find some that have been kind of dinged up a little bit in the grocery store for very cheap on the clearance table. Potatoes, we talked about this in the botany section and module. It's just a modified stem. So you cut the potato into several pieces, making sure you have a couple of eyes, and you propagated the particular potato. So if you like Yukon Gold or purple ones or red ones or Red Bliss or, the russet potatoes, that's what you're going to get. You're cloning them. You want to make sure when you cut them, the tubers apart, that you let them callus or dry over for a couple of days. Usually I cut them on one day, leave them in a air conditioned space so they'll dry. Usually takes 2 maybe 3 days in Florida if the humidity is high or your AC isn't running or heat. So make sure it's not damp anymore, otherwise it'll rot. Onions, again, you don't generally replant the onion bulb, but I have seen people actually take the scallions, and if they don't, they cut off the root end, replant that, and it'll grow. Um, Kitchen scrap gardening, if you will. Chayote, if you like that, or Merlaton. I think also alligator pear is a common name. You can get a small one of those fruit, and it will sprout. I talked about garlic a little bit earlier. If you plant a clove of garlic the size of the end of your little finger, you're going to harvest a bulb about the size of your thumb. So you don't get a lot of production out of garlic in Florida because of the warm temperatures. Cassava is something we usually don't grow, but again, that could be planted as well if that's a vegetable you enjoy. Watering the garden. Veggie gardens will need frequent watering at first and less frequent watering as it matures. It can be done with the watering can if it's a small garden. It can be done with the hose. It can be done with overhead sprinklers. However, overhead sprinklers being macro or large volume irrigation devices will be restricted to once a week watering. As a side note to irrigation, we do not recommend that you irrigate edible crops with reclaimed water unless you peel, cook, or thermally process the produce. Notice what I said. We don't recommend that you use reclaimed water unless you peel, cook, or thermally process the produce. For example, you pick tomatoes and peppers and onions and you chop them all up and you make a wonderful salsa and you serve it fresh. That hasn't been cooked or thermally processed. We would not recommend that you would consume it if it's been irrigated with reclaimed water. Now you make that same salsa dish that I just described and you put it into the canning jars and you can it properly. Then after the canning process you could consume that because that particular version of salsa has been thermally processed or heated to kill any microorganisms. One of the best ways to water veggies is from drip or micro irrigation systems. Drip and micro irrigation systems are not currently restricted in what days of the week you can use them. They are restricted at what times of the day you can use them, which follows the typical water restriction times. But you can use them on any day of the week as long as it's during the irrigation event times. So here in the upper left-hand picture, you can see somebody watering, appears to be tomatoes. Again, I see a lot of people wetting up the foliage. You don't need to water leaves. Plants do not absorb water through the leaves. So try to keep the foliage dry whenever it's possible to reduce disease spread. In the upper right-hand photograph, you can see that fan of water. That's a hose with a sprinkler attached to it that may oscillate back and forth or what, I'm not quite sure. That is consider high volume irrigation. That would be restricted to once a week watering, depending on your watering day, or twice a week if you had reclaimed. But again, you got to either peel, thermally process, or cook that produce. The lower left hand photograph is a micro sprinkler. I much prefer micro sprinklers over drip, which is the lower right hand picture. Micro sprays have the advantage of covering a relatively nice area to irrigate, roughly 3 to 6 feet across. Because you can see the water spraying there, you know that it's getting to where you want it to go. In the lower right hand photograph, you can kind of see a manifold of drip tubing. The drip tubing has holes every so many inches apart, usually a foot, or it could be 6 inches or maybe even 18. It depends on the drip hose you have. You have to put your plant right by the hole where it drips because the lateral movement of water in sandy soils is more or less straight down. So you're watering a little small area of the root system and not much of it. And if this were under the mulch, which it isn't, you wouldn't be able to see if water is coming out or the distribution is even. As a side note to drip, I was watching a television cooking show on PBS a couple of years ago, and they're out in an organic tomato field in California. And the host was saying, what do you do? How do you grow them? And this and that. And then she asked, well, how do you control the weeds? And the gentleman said, well, because of this drought and we have drip, we don't have too many weeds growing because the tomato plants were pretty much shading the ground and the water was so concentrated in such a small area that really the weeds didn't have a chance to get enough water. He said the drought was helping him tremendously in weed control. Well, that's not where I'm going with that, although now you understand why we have so many weeds in Florida, because we usually don't go through years and years of drought like California can. But she asked, well, what do you do when you get rain? He said, we were out there, and this was 40 acres of organic tomatoes. He said, we hoe the weeds by hand. Can you imagine hoeing 40 acres of tomatoes with a hoe? I can think of some other fun things to do rather than that. Irrigation, water early in the day, close to sun up, early morning. That'll give the leaves a chance to dry out very quickly and remain dry for as long as it's possible before nightfall. This reduces disease incidences. This would be true of any landscape plant for that matter. We recommend watering closer to sun up versus the sun going down. Young plants need about 1 inch of irrigation per week, but they need it fairly frequently. Remember, some of these don't have much of a root system or they're germinating, so this may be allocated in 1/8 inch increments daily or something like that. Mature plants need about 2 inches of water, but infrequently. A few years ago, I had a gentleman trying to grow, I believe it was tomatoes, and he said they keep on wilting, they keep on wilting, and he's watering, and he's watering, and he's watering, and he's watering. Well, I said, tell me, how much are you watering and when and all this? Well, he watered when he first got up in the morning. Then he would see them wilt at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. That phenomenon is called heat wilt. This is common. And when he saw that, he'd water them. And then a couple hours later, as the sun's going down, they're wilting again. Well, he was watering 3 times a day. Meanwhile, we had tomatoes growing in the demo vegetable garden, and we were watering maybe once a week if we remembered to, and they weren't wilting nearly as badly as his being watered 3 times a week. What do you think was happening? He probably had a good case of root rot going on his tomatoes, and they had a limited root system to still be alive to absorb water. So, too much of a good thing is too much. Fertilizing the garden. Doesn't matter whether you are a conventional vegetable gardener or an organic vegetable gardener. You will need to use fertilizer in order to get production of your crop. Again, kind of a review from plant nutrition and soils. Plants need these primary macronutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Those were the big three numbers on the bag. The secondary nutrients are calcium, magnesium, and sulfur, generally needed in about 0.5% by volume by the plant tissue. Micronutrients are needed in a fraction of a percent by weight of plant tissue. Boron, chlorine, copper, iron, manganese, not magnesium, manganese, molybdenum, zinc, and nickel. As I talked about, nickel before is still, although no longer debated as essential, the chances of ever seeing a nickel deficiency in your life is about zero. So we generally will never ever recommend supplementing nickel for any kind of plant. But these plants need these elements in order to grow, or chemicals. Remember, we're made out of star stuff, as Dr. Carl Sagan used to say. A lot of the fertilizers we use are what we call inorganic. That doesn't necessarily mean they're bad. It just means that they were made by humans in some way, shape, or form, or don't contain carbon. Now, again, kind of a review. We have complete fertilizers that would have the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. By definition, if it has all three of those elements, it's considered complete. That doesn't mean it has all the essential elements needed for plant growth. Typically, we use a ratio of 1 to 1 to 1, like a 6-6-6, or an 8-8-8, or a 10-10-10, or a 12-12-12. Let's start with the last example, 12-12-12. How does that differ from 6-6-6? How many of you are going math? Darn it, he's bringing math back up. Are you noticing there's some repeating themes in this vegetable gardening talk as well? pH, nutrients, micronutrients, macronutrients, math. That'll probably haunt you on the final, huh? Hint, hint. So, 12-12-12. I need half as much 12-12-12 per thousand square feet as I do 6-6-6. Remember how we calculate how much we would need for 1,000 square feet? Doesn't matter if it's flower garden, vegetable garden, or turf. We take that first number and divide it into our constant. Our constant was 100. So 100 divided by 6 is how much? Versus 12 of a 12-12-12 divided into 100. So keep that in mind when shopping. The tag will show what's in the bag, or it'll be printed on the bag nowadays more commonly. It may also contain secondary and macronutrients, some of which may be critically needed in vegetable garden. Magnesium is commonly deficient in soils. You would know if you did a soil test. Fertilizers could be water soluble. We kind of talked about that already. Or they may be water insoluble or slow release. Or in some cases, they may be from organic sources. It doesn't really matter just as long as the plants get the essential nutrients that they need, whether it's from an organic version of the nutrient or a non-organic version of the nutrient. It's still required by plants, whether you're a conventional gardener or an organic gardener. I typically fertilize with granular fertilizer in most applications in landscapes, flower beds, and vegetable garden. It's more economical than liquid. It doesn't need to be applied nearly as often as liquid, which I'll talk a little bit about in a moment. So we have a bucket of fertilizer that the gentleman will spread. Sometimes we broadcast spread it, or we may side dress it as the season progresses. You do want to make sure you keep fertilizer off of the leaves or the foliage of the plants, as it can burn. Now, I won't expect you to remember all this, but Again, when banding, you kind of put out about 2 to 3 pounds of that per 100-foot row is what that boils down to. Okay, well, but I like the formula of dividing the first number into 100, and yes, that's for 1,000 square feet, but you compare that down to maybe 100 square foot of veggie garden or something like that. Fertilizing. During the growing season, we fertilize with granular about every 4 to 6 weeks. Now, if you're using a lot of slow release, a high percentage, you may go more infrequently than the 4 to 6 weeks. It may be closer to every 2 months, especially in the winter months when it's cooler. But again, you may have to apply a little more than my formula because of its slow release characteristic. Generally speaking, I don't go too crazy hog wild with super high amounts of slow release fertilizer in veggie gardening because the plants need that nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, etc., relatively evenly and quickly during their growth. During the season, you can side dress. If it's an organic fertilizer sourced from an organic source of various types, it's usually almost always fairly slow to release its nutrition. That's kind of a con of organic fertilizers in their slow release characteristics and sometimes inhibit production a bit. I mentioned liquid. I usually only use liquid for that starter solution or when I have vegetables or flowers or something in a limited soil volume like a container. That's due to it's hard to apply evenly a liquid and it's very expensive over the cost of a granular fertilizer. We have a gentleman that frequently stops by our office and he uses exclusively liquid fertilizer and I keep on telling him you need to use it every 2 weeks. Well, he's bumped it up to about every 2 weeks, but he doesn't put out enough volume. He thinks 50 gallons for 2,500 square feet should be adequate. It's woefully inadequate. So here's corn. Corn's a relatively heavy feeder, needs quite a bit of fertilizer. In fact, corn I would probably fertilize about every 3 weeks during the growing season. So when people bring in these little miniature ears of corn that look like something that came from a Thai restaurant stir fry or Chinese restaurant stir fry, I know they didn't fertilize it much, if at all. So again, this is usually put just past the drip line of the plant. The roots will be out there. Now, some people will incorporate this or scratch it into the ground. It's okay if you do it carefully and lightly cultivate. Most of what the cultivation is going to do is cut off any weed seedlings from the root system and kill them. If you do too much cultivation, you may damage the feeder roots of your various vegetable plants. Let's end part 3 of vegetable gardening. Join me in part 4.